guess that's the simplest way to say it, has been around for many years, and there's a number of companies and also nonprofits that have taken that software and done other things with it. There's a version of Vista that was created by a company called MedSphere, which is one of the first companies that took software from the federal government and commercialized it. It wasn't really open source, but they created an open source version, and then they have a commercial version. There's another version of it called World Vista. It's used in Jordan and other countries. So the VA has made a decision to take their original software and make it open source and turn it into an open source project. And right now they're asking people to help them, companies, organizations, to help them consider how they can create it. In fact, they've actually requested for someone to consider how they might do something called a custodial agent, where an organization would hold the intellectual property and they would be able to use it back again to help create a community. So they're trying to figure out a way to get the software outside of the government. So this is a trend we're seeing. There's a lot of thoughtful process happening today. And even yesterday here at the conference, someone from a federal agency got together with a number of people from the open source community, from some community leadership and people interested in open health IT, and said, can you help me think about how we might take software that we've been using for years to do research and make it available so people can use it and we can sustain the community. So these are two very important problems to solve and interesting. The federal government also has been doing a lot of talking about open source. It's not the same as doing something, but it's an interesting trend. And whenever you see people talking publicly about open source, people are more comfortable about talking what they're actually doing. When I started the Government Open Source Conference in 2005, for every agency that was willing to come talk about what they were doing with open source in their government agency, I knew 8 other CIOs that had projects that just weren't ready to talk about them. They were uncomfortable. They wanted to focus on their operations. They didn't want to arm wrestle with whatever. Maybe there was a vendor that had a commercial product that they didn't want to have to argue with, that they didn't want to talk to the councilman or the guy's brother-in-law or be in front of the legislature to justify how they had done something unusual. They just want to get work done. So there are a lot of instances where open source is used, but no one really knows about it. Well, when you start having these open conversations, then people feel safer about talking about their stories. And so we're finding that there really are very few federal agencies that aren't using open source. The Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security several years ago started to think about open source as a strategy for interoperability and communicating. And they wanted to figure out how they could help local governments exchange information more freely, make information more available. Because if you think about the idea that all data is local, but you have no way to easily share it, or you can't use contemporary technology like geospatial information, GIS information, because let's say you're a small county, you can't afford an Esri license. Esri is a company that makes fantastic software, but if you're not a big agency, you may not be able to afford it. So Department of Homeland Security started bringing together private companies and local agencies and saying, how can we work together because what we want to do is we want to move more to seeing open source being used. So how can you work with that? That started 2 years ago. More recently, the Department of State has a series called Tech at State. It's part of their e-diplomacy project. They're trying to build more interest in goodwill and using technology for the civil society. They focused on open source about 3 weeks ago. I joined a number of other great people to talk at this particular event, and they filled the State Department full of, I think they booked out, it was free, but they sold out of seats, and I think we had about 300 people there for that event. But again, they're increasingly comfortable. In terms of operations, the State Department actually has about 150 web servers where they provide websites for small field operations. Although the people that hosted the event didn't even know that they had done that. And that's really typical of a federal agency. Everybody doesn't know what everybody else is doing. NASA next week is going to have its own open source summit in Mountain View. They have been doing open source for some time, and I'll touch on a couple of their projects. But they would like to have some people come and help them think about how they can open source more of the work they do. DHS, this is again the Department of Homeland Security, more recently made a decision to start making some investments. And this is the research and development arm of DHS. They help explore a number of technologies. The cybersecurity group looks at all kinds of technology to see if they can forward their mission of making the country more secure. The open source got on their radar probably 4 or 5 years ago, and they realized that it could be key to solving some security problems, and were willing to make some investments in small projects specifically. And then more recently, they felt it would be helpful to help share more of that information. I mentioned that there's not a lot of use cases, a lot of case studies available, and they're interested in, if nothing else, exposing to the community who's there. Now this is a project that I'm a consultant on. And we'll see something in the public eye by the end of the year. We're starting the process of talking to local agencies about what they might need, but it's really a government to government kind of a portal to help agencies understand more about open source and open security technology. I mentioned NASA has some projects going. Although there is a debate within the open source community about whether this is good or bad, they actually have their own OSI approved license. OSI is the international body that has all the approved or issued licenses. Projects like Whirlwind are projects where they've taken, they've opted to make their project open source. This is it's similar to Google Earth. It's a 3D rendering program. And you can do flyovers of mountains, and it's being used now. It became open source. It was written on Java. They moved to a Java platform. And there are companies that are actually building their commercial projects based on NASA's work. The original work was done to help them educate people. They have a mission of sharing everything they know when they do exploration. They needed a better way for people to be able to visualize and use it. But they decided that what they really wanted to do was even make a platform available. They also, more recently this last year, announced that they were using open source as a base for cloud computing, which is a whole other conversation we won't talk about, but that's one of the things they're doing. Lots of states have open source projects. The state of New York, this last year, the Senate started using open source to make all of their legislative data available. I mean, they're really proud of the fact you can, you can track a bill on your iPad, or you can track a bill on your Android. In Oregon, the legislature wanted to make distance education available to underserved communities and kids who were living in areas that might not be able to get to class. And they built a K-12 portal so students and teachers can be engaged in distance learning. And all these projects, after the talk this afternoon, I'll be posting slides and I'll have links so you can go back and look through all of these. But I want to leave room for time for questions, and I'll be around this afternoon to talk about any of these in depth if you're interested. One of the most interesting projects I saw, and again, these spring up, and they're not coordinated, but this is where open source is getting an uptake. In 2005, I was wondering why there were 12 CIOs from 12 departments of corrections in 12 states at the government open source conference. They were a great group of people, but I just thought it was an odd coincidence. And I asked them what they were doing there. They said, well, we're having our annual meeting. We have an open source project. We actually run our prisons on open source software. They had built the system for themselves because these systems are very expensive. And especially when budget times are lean and you go to get your budget, the Department of Corrections and prisons are not very high on the list of things that people want to fund. And IT for a prison is not very high at all. So these are some of the most resourceful people I've ever met. And in 2004, they started a project and they actually run more prisons with open source software than any other single proprietary vendor. So my hat's off to these guys for doing this project. Another group of very resourceful people, also in the public safety space, this is the LEADER project. It started with South Carolina and Tennessee. This slide is dated. Since this slide was written, Alabama has also joined. So there are closer to 500 agencies, that state, local. It includes the statewide law enforcement, the local prisons, the probation officer, anyone that's in that information food chain that has anything to do with people that of interest for public safety. What they did was they pooled some first responder dollars they got one year. They had a couple of counties that had done a small open source project, and the state of Tennessee was really impressed. It was a web-based system. It was all open source, and they wanted to distribute it in the state. So Tennessee and South Carolina pooled first responder dollars, the kind of money that you typically use for new fire trucks or radios, and they thought, let's do an IT project. And so they've just made this available to any state that would like to use it. And it's now in 3 states and growing. Some of the local projects, San Francisco has a project, has an Open 311 project. Does anybody not know what 311 is? 311? Okay, so that's the non-emergency government number. So, burning building, 911, burning question, like why, what do we do, the dead dog in my driveway? It's 311. They've built a system that's available to anyone that helps people collect that information in a web base and build a knowledge base, and it's an API or ways to build into the voice system because it's 311 is the number. Newport News, Virginia, great example of sharing and things we learned from it. They use the Plone content management system to build a whole suite of e-government applications. They actually donated that software into the world plone.gov project. Belgium now uses the City of Newport News' module that does public hearings, where you schedule public hearings and you record them and you make the outcome available on the internet. So there's a little international community. And they also, I think this is the first instance of open source software as a municipal service. They also provide their software to a smaller municipal government that didn't want to actually host the software and run it themselves because they didn't have people that were skilled to do it. So for like $150 a month, there's a little city that uses the same software. I think that is actually going to be the model for the future, is to use these kinds of applications.